those who do succeed can hardly fail to be impressed by all that the ego does not know and never has known. This increase in self-knowledge is still very rare nowadays and is usually paid for in advance with a neurosis, if not something worse. So here he's moving us on a bit and suggesting that there are kind of dynamics and forces at work inside our psyche that we may personally be unrelated to in the sense of being the creators of them, and yet they have very powerful effects on our lives. Now, in a way, this isn't so surprising because archetypes for him, for Jung, included, for example, the ability of a bird to build a nest, even when it's never been taught or seen a nest being built. That, for Jung, is one kind of archetype. I think some birds do learn how to build nests from watching, but many don't, I understand. Another archetype would be those that are often explored in mathematics. So you might say there's an archetype of a triangle. It seems to have a kind of existence that maths discovers rather than creates. Many mathematicians do have this experience of exploring a kind of archetypal world. So that sense that there's more going on in the inner life of things than we often assume, certainly these days, actually makes quite immediate sense. But he thought that there are archetypes in our own psyches too, and a common one that's discussed nowadays is the archetype of the shadow. And this is parts of ourselves that we don't like for one reason or another. We try to keep at bay, but that very act of keeping it at bay sort of forms it into what Jung calls a complex, which is a kind of entity that has meaning and affect attached to it by us, often, in this case anyway, affect of fear. And it has a kind of autonomous life of its own, and we may often not know about our shadow. It just pops up every so often when we meet someone and for some reason we don't really understand, can't bear to be in their presence, say. And one possibility there is that this person is too close to the shadow inside you. And so when you see them, you are also unconsciously seeing your shadow and want to get out of their presence. And then he also thought that what can happen is that at the collective level, some individuals or maybe some saints embody collective archetypes as well, and that's why they become so impressive and so important. I mean, you might wonder why some politicians, for example, we seem to relate to them as more or less successful politicians, whereas other politicians, we seem to relate to them in a much more sort of strange and bigger, in a way, more powerful way. And that, Jung would say, is because they are embodying or personifying archetypes for us all. And, you know, figures like, say, Trump, or figures maybe even like Boris Johnson here in the UK, people don't really relate to them rationally. They relate to them in a more visceral or primitive way. And, you know, certainly in Trump's case, it's one way of understanding how he can so divide America, that one group of people see him as one kind of archetype, maybe the trickster savior, something like that. Whereas others look at him and see him in a completely different light and see him as, you know, maybe mad or maybe devilish or whatever it might be. Some public figures do seem to take on this bigger role, and Jung would say that's because they embody an archetype. And then, of course, in religions, in spiritual traditions, saints and gurus and wise figures, you know, they may in part be very wise, but when they take on a life of their own, and the devotion to them, say, becomes somewhat excessive, or when after they die, they're remembered through icons and stories and myths and so on. Jung would say that's because they become personifications or embody an archetype that it's important for us to relate to.